The wind in Wyoming Territory doesn't just blow, it howls, it screams. It sounds like a wounded beast. And in the winter of 1887, it was promising another merciless night. Snow fell in thick, blinding curtains, burying the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge under a shroud of white. In a tiny cabin at the edge of town, a cabin that groaned under the weight of the snow, Margaret Sullivan pressed her face against a frosted window. It had been 2 winters since cholera stole her husband, James. 2 long winters alone with their son, 7-year-old Thomas. "Mama, I'm hungry," a small voice whispered from the darkness. Margaret's heart clenched. She turned to look at her son, a small bundle of blankets near the dying fire. His face was gaunt, his eyes too big. She forced a smile. "I know, sweetheart. Mama's going to town to get us something to eat." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Their last bit of flour was gone 3 days ago. The last strip of dried meat was a distant memory. Pride had kept her from begging. But pride was a luxury a mother with a starving child could not afford. The walk to town was a battle. Snowdrifts grabbed at her legs. The cold seeped through the worn-out soles of her boots. By the time she reached Main Street, her skirts were frozen stiff. The general store was warm. The smell of coffee and fresh bread made her stomach twist into a painful knot. Behind the counter, Hiram Fletcher's cold eyes sized her up. "Mrs. Sullivan, what brings you here?" Margaret held her chin high. "Mr. Fletcher, I need provisions. For my boy. I can work. Cleaning, mending, anything." Fletcher let out a harsh laugh. "Work? Half the town's looking for work, and you still owe me for last month's flour." "Please," Margaret begged, hating the sound of her own voice. "Just a little bread. For my son." "Can't help you," he said, turning his back. "Try the church." But the church offered no salvation. The preacher's wife looked right through her. "We've already distributed this week's charity. Perhaps if you attended services more regularly." The message was clear. Even God's mercy had a price. Defeated, Margaret stood in the town square. Smoke curled from the chimneys of warm houses where families were sitting down to dinner. Through a window, she saw roast beef on the Hartley's table. Mrs. Hartley had been her friend once, before James died, before she became a widow, before she became a burden. That's when she heard 2 men talking. "That trader's back," one said, "the one who deals with the Comanche." "Brave or foolish," the other replied, "though I hear he's got grain to spare, willing to trade for most anything." The first man chuckled, a dark, ugly sound. "Most anything. I wonder what a Comanche would trade grain for." Margaret's pulse hammered in her ears. She knew the whispers about this trader. A man who walked between worlds. A half-breed, some said. A white man gone native, said others. A man who had supplies when no one else did. Desperation is a powerful thing. It can make you walk into the dark, toward a danger you can't yet name. As night fell, Margaret made her way to the old trading post on the edge of town. The building stood alone, shunned by the rest of Cedar Ridge. She pushed open the heavy door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The air inside was thick with the smell of furs, tobacco, and something else. Something wild. Behind a rough counter, a man stood in the flickering lamplight. He was tall, powerfully built, with long black hair that fell past his shoulders. His face was all sharp angles and quiet dignity. He was Comanche. His dark eyes found hers and the world seemed to stop. "You need something," he said. It wasn't a question. Margaret's voice was a dry whisper. "I need bread. Grain. For my son." He studied her for a long moment. "You have trade?" She shook her head. Her hands trembled as she reached for her shawl, her fingers fumbling with the knot. She was about to offer the only thing she had left, the last piece of herself. "I have—" The words were agony. "Myself." The silence that followed was a physical thing. She stood there, her shame a heavy cloak. She waited for him to accept, to take what she had offered. Instead, his expression changed. Not to lust, not to greed, but to something she couldn't read. "No," he said quietly. Humiliation washed over her, hot and sickening. She turned to flee, to run back into the storm where she belonged. But his next words stopped her cold. "I do not want your body," the Comanche warrior said, his dark eyes holding hers. "I want your heart." Margaret couldn't move. The man's words echoed in the small lamplit room, making no sense. He wanted her heart. She had come here prepared to sell her body, and he had refused, leaving her with a shame so profound it was almost a relief. He moved from behind the counter, his steps silent on the rough floorboards. He picked up a cloth-wrapped bundle. The smell of fresh bread hit her, and her knees almost gave out. "Take this," he said, his voice gentle. "Feed your son." She stared at the bundle, then at him. "But I can't pay." "Go home," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Your child needs you." She fled into the night, clutching the bread, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. The walk home was a blur of falling snow and hot tears. What kind of man was he? What did he mean? Back in the cabin, she found Thomas asleep. She built up the fire and unwrapped the bundle. It wasn't just bread. There was dried meat, cornmeal, and a small handful of peppermint sticks. She woke Thomas, and as she watched him eat, a new kind of tears came. Gratitude, bewilderment, and a chilling thought. A stranger, a Comanche warrior, now knew the absolute depth of her desperation. The next morning the town already knew. The whispers started, sharp and cruel. That Sullivan woman at the trading post last night, alone with that savage. Lord knows what she did for that food. Margaret's face burned, but she held her head high. Thomas was fed. That's all that mattered. But then the preacher's wife came to call. "My dear Mrs. Sullivan," she began, her voice dripping with false piety. "I've heard the most distressing rumors, associating with those heathens. What example does that set for your son?" "The heathen fed my son when your church turned us away," Margaret said, her voice dangerously quiet. The woman left in a huff, but Margaret felt a new kind of fear. She had survived starvation, but could she survive the judgment of her own people? That night she found another bundle on her doorstep. More food, firewood, and a pair of small, perfectly stitched mittens that would fit Thomas. There were no footprints. The wind had already erased them. This secret kindness continued for days, but with each gift the town's hostility grew. Work she'd been promised was suddenly unavailable. Women crossed the street to avoid her. Thomas came home with a bloody nose, a cruel slur ringing in his ears. One evening she saw him, Joseph standing bare. He stood at the edge of the woods watching her cabin. Their eyes met across the snowy distance. He gave a slight nod, then was gone. The next day, Sheriff Watson was on her doorstep. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm here about your activities. You've been seen accepting goods from that Comanche trader. We can't have women engaging in improper relations." The threat was clear. That night, no bundle appeared. A blizzard hit, trapping them in the cabin for 2 days, their food dwindling once more. Had the sheriff's warning worked? Had she been abandoned again? On the third night, when the storm finally broke, Margaret knew she couldn't wait. She went to the trading post. The moon was a silver dollar in a black velvet sky. He was there, as if he'd been waiting. "You stopped," she said. "The sheriff came to you. You have trouble because of me." She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "I had trouble before you. Starving is its own kind of trouble." He was silent for a long moment. "My name is Joseph Standing Bear. My mother was Comanche. My father was a missionary who left his world for her." The confession explained so much. A man caught between two worlds belonging to neither. "Why?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Why help me?" "A body can be given away," he said, his dark eyes searching hers. "But a heart must be earned, and it must choose to be given." As she walked home, a new thought began to take shape in her mind. This man hadn't just saved her from starvation. He had seen past her shame, past her desperation, and had offered her something she thought she'd lost forever. Dignity. But that dignity came with a price. Because Silas Blackwood and his friends weren't just angry about a widow and a Comanche. They were afraid. Afraid of a woman who wouldn't break, and afraid of a man who saw her heart, not just her skin. And their fear was about to turn deadly. The first hint of spring brought a new kind of danger. One morning, Margaret was gathering firewood when a low growl froze her in place. A wolf, lean and hungry, stepped out from behind a fallen tree. Before she could scream, an arrow hissed through the air. The wolf dropped. Joseph emerged from the woods, silent as a ghost. "You should not come here alone," he said, his voice calm. He helped her carry the wood back to her cabin. Thomas was sick, his cough echoing in the small room. Margaret, despite knowing the risk, invited Joseph inside. The warrior's presence seemed to fill the tiny space. Thomas, his fever-bright eyes wide with curiosity, peppered him with questions. "Are you a real Indian? Can you shoot a bow?" Joseph answered each question with a grave patience that captivated the boy. He told stories of the hunt, of the land, of his mother's people who believed the earth was a grandmother who provided for all. "Is that why you help us?" Thomas asked. "Because we need." Joseph's eyes met Margaret's. Sometimes people need to know they are not alone. His visit did not go unnoticed. That afternoon, Adelaide Morrison, one of the few women in town who had shown Margaret any kindness, came to her with a warning. "Margaret, you have to be careful. Silas Blackwood and his men, they're saying that traitor is corrupting you. They want to run him off. They're getting liquored up at the saloon." The blood drained from Margaret's face. She told Thomas to bar the door and ran to the trading post. She found Joseph packing his saddlebags. "You know," he said, his voice heavy, "you can't leave. You've done nothing wrong." "I have disrupted their peace," he said. "That is wrong enough." "Forgive me for what?" Margaret's voice was shaking with a rage she hadn't known she possessed. "For accepting kindness? For not starving quietly like a good widow should?" Her tirade was cut short by the sound of hoofbeats and angry shouts. A mob, led by Blackwood, surrounded the trading post, their faces ugly in the torchlight. "Step away from him, Mrs. Sullivan," Blackwood snarled. Margaret moved closer to Joseph, and then a small voice cried out, "Mama!" Thomas stood in the doorway. He ran, not to his mother, but to Joseph, wrapping his arms around the warrior's leg. "Don't let them hurt him, Mama. He's our friend." The sight of the small boy clinging to the man they had come to punish gave the mob pause. "This changes everything," Margaret said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. She took her son's hand. "This man saved my son from starvation while you turned your backs. He protected me from a wolf while you gossiped about my virtue. If that makes him a savage and you civilized, then I choose savagery." The mob wavered, but Blackwood was not so easily deterred. "This ain't over," he hissed as the men grudgingly dispersed. He was right. 3 nights later, Margaret woke to the splintering of her cabin door. Blackwood and 4 of his men burst in. "Where is he?" Blackwood demanded, grabbing her. "I don't know," she gasped. "Lying Jezebel." Fletcher, the storekeeper, backhanded her across the face. One of the other men grabbed a terrified Thomas. "Maybe she needs proper motivation," the man sneered. They dragged Margaret and her son out into the freezing night. They were heading for the old abandoned mine shaft, a place where the town's dark justice was often served. But they didn't get far. An arrow sang out of the darkness, taking the man holding Thomas in the shoulder. Joseph. He had come back. The clearing exploded into violence. Joseph fought with the ferocity of a cornered panther, but he was outnumbered. A rifle butt caught him across the temple, and he went down. Blackwood stood over him, a knife gleaming in his hand. "Gonna gut you like the animal you are." "No!" Margaret screamed, launching herself at Blackwood. He threw her off, but the distraction was all Joseph needed. He surged up, grabbing Blackwood's wrist. Then a rifle shot cracked through the night. Sheriff Watson stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle smoking. Behind him stood Judge Campbell and a handful of other townsmen, their faces grim. "That's enough, Blackwood." The judge's voice was like ice. "I witnessed you dragging a woman and child from their home." The confrontation was over. Blackwood and his men were arrested. But then the sheriff turned to Joseph. "Joseph Standing Bear, you're under arrest for wounding 2 men." The trial was a spectacle. Blackwood and Fletcher told their twisted story, but under the judge's sharp questioning, it fell apart. Margaret testified, her voice clear and strong, telling the truth of Joseph's kindness. The most powerful testimony came from Thomas. "Mr. Joseph saved us," he said, his small voice filling the courtroom. "He's good. Anyone who says different is lying." The jury was out for only an hour. The verdict, justified defense. Joseph Standing Bear was a free man. Margaret pushed through the cheering crowd and threw her arms around him. He held her close, and in that moment, in front of the whole town, he whispered, "My heart is here." They had won, but their battle was far from over. Spring came, but the town remained divided. Joseph returned to his cabin, but now he visited Margaret and Thomas in broad daylight. He fixed her roof. He brought them food. He taught Thomas how to track, how to read the stars. He was becoming a part of their lives, a part of their family. One evening, Joseph took them to a hidden valley he owned, a beautiful secret place with a spring and rich grass. "I thought to build a house here," he said, a shy hope in his eyes. "Room for a family." "Will we live here?" Thomas asked, his own eyes wide with wonder. "All of us?" Joseph looked at Margaret. "If we do this," he said to the boy, "I won't be Mr. Joseph anymore. I'll be your father." Thomas's small face was solemn. "My first papa is with the angels. I think he would want us to have a new papa. Someone brave who takes care of us." The wedding was held at the courthouse. Ezra Blackwood, Silas's brother, tried to stop them, blocking the steps with a dozen men. But this time, the town stood with Margaret. Adelaide Morrison, the judge's wife, even the school teacher. They formed a line and faced the men down. "She has made her choice," Adelaide said, "and it's a braver choice than any of us have made." They were married by Judge Campbell, with Thomas standing as their witness. As they left the courthouse, a new family, they were met with a surprising sight. A delegation of Cheyenne leaders had come to honor Joseph, bringing gifts. Even Sheriff Watson came, offering a new Winchester rifle. "A man needs to protect his family," he said, a silent apology in his eyes. That evening, they made camp in their valley, their new home. Thomas was asleep, exhausted from the day. Margaret and Joseph sat by the fire, their hands intertwined. "I offered my body for bread," she whispered. "I thought I had nothing left." "You had your heart," he said, his voice soft, "and you gave it freely. That has been my greatest treasure." As the fire died to embers, Joseph began to sing, a soft Comanche prayer for new beginnings. Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, the promise of a future stretching out before them, as vast and beautiful as the Wyoming sky. Their story was just beginning, but they knew it would be a life built not on what the world demanded, but on what their hearts had chosen. They would face the future together, two worlds joined by a love that was stronger than hate, a love that had been earned, one act of kindness at a time. What did you think of Margaret and Joseph's journey? Their story shows that sometimes the greatest love isn't about finding the perfect person, but about having the courage to build a perfect love together. If their story touched your heart, let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of courage and love on the untamed frontier. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.